Welcome to Stock Issues of Policy Advocacy, Part 3, Blame. This is the third in a six-part series of presentations that talk about the stock issues. You should have already viewed the overview about what stock issues are and also learned about the stock issue of ill. This presentation will focus on the idea of blame. And more for fun than anything, I've got that little demotivator over there that the secret to success is knowing who to blame for your failures. And that's a fun image to put in here. Not necessarily the kind of blame that we're talking about, because blame is a very important but sometimes complex and poorly understood stock issue. Hopefully by the end of this presentation you'll have a little bit better understanding of what it is and the role that it plays in advocating for public policy. Other terms, and again I deal with them and agree with them to various degrees. If you've done competitive debate, you might have heard the term inherency. Inherency is consistent with the stock issue of blame. I also put up there cause, although it's more difficult and complex than that. Blame is the stock issue that forces us to investigate the why behind the problem. So if the ill is about the problem and the significance and how intense and how widespread or both a problem is, blame asks the question, why does that ill exist? Other way we might phrase the question is what allows the problem to persist and why haven't we fixed this already? One of the problems that we have with public policy is that we like to think that if there was a clear problem with an obvious solution, we would have fixed it already. But obviously there are not a lot of there are a lot of problems to which we haven't found solutions, or to which we are trying solutions with varying degrees of effectiveness, or for which we disagree greatly about what the most effective proposed solution would be. Part of the reason that we have the debates that we have about the proposed solutions is because of disagreement about why the problem exists in the first place. So instead of saying whose fault is it, or who's to blame, or what's to blame, the idea of blame asks the question of why does this problem exist and why haven't we fixed it already? Hopefully that's somewhat helpful. Oftentimes when we talk about blame or inherency, we talk about structural barriers or inherent barriers or barriers that act as blame or blame that acts as barriers. Again, what are the things that what are the conditions in the world as it currently exists that allow this problem to persist? The idea being some sort of a policy can remove or overcome these barriers. One type of barrier that we often see are structural barriers. That there are current laws that exist, and perhaps those laws have become outdated or outmoded, or various public officials see their hands tied because of the policies that currently exist. So that's one type of barrier that exists. So as we look at the problems that exist that we're trying to fix through the implementation of some new policy, are there current policies that are in the way that need to be repealed or amended or updated, or we need a policy in ways that we didn't need before because of some sort of structure? So that's one thing that you'll look at. And so the purpose of your policy advocacy then becomes, how can we appeal, amend, update, add additional policy, whatever, to overcome these structural barriers so that we can then get around to solving the problem. Hopefully that makes sense. The other kind of barrier that we often deal with that's a little bit trickier is the idea of an attitudinal barrier, where people's current beliefs and values and attitudes are what allows the problem to persist. So, if the prevailing attitude or belief or values is that some type of discrimination is okay, well, maybe we need to make a policy that makes that type of discrimination illegal. And we use the policy to force, and I hate to say that word, but ultimately that's kind of what happens, to force change in spite of people's beliefs and values. And this is one of the things that makes a public policy speech. As a society, we should change our laws to allow for or make happen these sorts of things, as opposed to the audience action speech, which is, people ought to be convinced of their own accord to do things regardless of what the actual policy is. So what we're trying to do is to get you to drill down to, okay, a problem exists. Why does this problem exist? What are the structural or attitudinal issues that surround this sort of policy that keep it from being solved by itself? And that's the idea of structural and attitudinal barriers. I had mentioned earlier that one of the things that we try to do is identify the cause of the problem, because if we understand the cause of the problem, we can better understand the solution to the problem. Again, part of the concern is that it's difficult to prove causation, and many of you have heard of this idea of correlation and causation. So we have the wonderful comic. I used to think that correlation implied causation. Then I took a statistics class. Now I don't. And his friend says, sounds like the class helped. Well, maybe. Just because he took the class doesn't necessarily mean that the class helped him to understand the difference between a correlation and a causation. Correlation means two things happen at the same time. Causation means that one of those things caused the other. Let me give you another example of a correlation versus a causation. Suppose we were interested in reading level in elementary school students. Well, there are a number of tests that an elementary school kid can take that gives us some sense of what their reading level is. Another statistic that we could look at is the number of grade level books that child happens to have in their house. So we could get a bunch of kids and test their reading, count the number of books in their house, and lo and behold, we find this fairly strong correlation that the more books there are in the kid's house, the higher the kid's reading level. Let's pretend that correlation exists. I don't know if it really does, but we can probably safely assume that that kind of correlation exists. But all we have is a correlation. Can we say from that more books in the home will increase the reading level of kids? Right? We're very quick to assume more books causes a higher reading level. But notice that it could be just the opposite. Maybe kids who are better at reading like having books at home to read, ask their parents to get them for them, ask for them for their birthday, for Christmas, whatever. And maybe instead of more books causing a higher reading level is the cause for more books in the home. We don't know which way the causation goes. Oftentimes, another secret factor, like parental income, is a better correlation and cause for both. Kids with more books in the house have more books because their parents can afford to buy more books, who are also the same parents who, for a variety of other reasons, tend to have more successful children in school. So now we're looking at three different factors. We don't know what causes what. We can't say, I will solve the illiteracy problem by giving kids more books. It's more complex than that. And so one of the things that we need to do as a policy advocate is try as best we can to figure out what we think the influential causes might be, but be very aware of the fact that it's not as simple and as clear-cut as it could be. However, as best as we can determine the cause, the better. Let me give you another quick analogy on this, kind of as we go to our review. Right? We have an ill and a blame and a cure and a cost benefit that are the four different stock issues. Ill means we're sick. Blame, we would kind of like to know why we are sick, because that is going to influence our choice of a cure. So if I'm ill and I'm coughing and I have a runny nose, I clearly have an ill. But before we start prescribing a cure, kind of nice to know if that's a cold or if that's a flu, because I'm going to treat a cold very differently than I'm going to treat the flu. Same thing happens with public policy. We have problems. The better that we can understand the blame or the cause, and again, I'm hesitant to use that word, or the barriers that keep us from solving this on our own, the better we can prescribe an appropriate cure, which is the next stock issue. So we've learned about blame in this presentation. Watch the other presentations to learn details about cure, cost, benefit, and how we use stock issues to organize a speech.